I think that, of course, Basel III is not an easy hurdle for Japanese banks. I think Japanese banks should be able to satisfy the new requirement from the Basel III. In terms of the new capital requirement, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, Japan's banking system weathered the global financial crisis relatively well. And now Japanese banks are in a situation where they can accumulate profit in order to increase their own capital. So I think they can overcome the new requirement by their own business effort. And the second reason is that some Japanese banks, especially big banks, had already increased the capital, anticipating the introduction of the Basel III. And in terms of the liquidity standard, which is newly introduced, in terms of liquidity, due to the business characteristics, Japanese banks have abundant liquidity. And first of all, on the liability side, they have a stable funding source, that is a household deposit. And on the asset side, they have abundant JGBs. So in terms of liquidity standard, Japanese banks are in a favorable position to satisfy the sort of new requirement. Of course, Basel III is not an easy hurdle. Due to these reasons, I believe Japanese banks should be able to overcome the new requirement. Yes, Bank of Japan argues that Japanese banks should reduce the holding of equities. And as you know, in 2002, Bank of Japan introduced the purchasing program of equities held by banks. There's a couple of reasons why Bank of Japan took such sort of the extraordinary policies. First reason is that during the period of 2002, at the midst of Japanese financial crisis, banks were suffering from the shortage of risk-taking capacity. So Bank of Japan took a part of such risks so as to, in fact, increase their risk-taking capacity. And the second basic reason is that, according to our assessment, the risks involved in their stock holding is a bit too excessive. So, because the volatility of stock prices is much larger than that of the bond holding. So, we believe that the Japanese banks should reduce a little bit their holding of equities. So, and in fact, since then, Japanese banks, especially big banks, have reduced the amount of their equity holding. So, I think in terms of the equity holding and the risks associated with such sort of equity holding, Japanese banks are now proceeding towards the right direction. In terms of the JGB, we do not see any urgent necessity to put some sort of risk weight on our own sovereign debt, because, as you know, in Japan has an external surplus country, and the JGB are basically held by domestic investors, and the government already published their plan for the fiscal consolidation in the future. And as you know, even after the earthquake, the yen appreciation and the yield on JGB are still on the downtrend rather than uptrend. This fact shows that the domestic investors as well as the foreign investors still maintain the confidence towards the Japan's sovereign debt. Of course, Japan as a whole continue their best effort for fiscal consolidation, but at this juncture, we do not see any necessity for the sovereign debt. And as a more broad framework, of course, as you mentioned, this year there's a couple of countries who suffered from new sovereign risks. Especially the peripheral European countries. So for each financial institutions, it is becoming much more important to manage the risks associated with their sovereign debt investment. But in Japan in particular, we do not see any necessity to put some risk weight on JGBs. Yeah, very important point, because we experienced our own financial crisis in 1990s, and we experienced a very sluggish economic growth after the crisis due to the very strong downward pressure associated with financial crisis and very strong balance sheet adjustment pressure. And now we see some sort of the similarity in United States and some European countries. For example, in the United States, the tempo of the recovery is a bit slow compared to the former phases of economic recovery, maybe due to the strong downward pressure from the household and the corporations balance sheet adjustment pressure. And we already experienced this sort of the phenomena, and we understand the importance of maintaining the core financial intermediation functions which support the economic recovery, especially as a phase of very critical phase of the recovery. And in that sense, it is very important to maintain the neutral views on the banking industry. For example, we also experienced a period of public fund injection to the banking sector. And after the public fund injection, politicians as well as the public opinions are very likely to be hostile against the banking industry. They argue that they should strengthen, or they should impose very strict regulation so as to penalize the banking industry. But this sort of the sentiment is very problematic, especially as a phase of economic recovery. And of course, it is important to strengthen the financial regulation so as to avoid another financial crisis. But we need to strike a right balance between maintaining the financial stability and maintaining the financial functions, core financial functions. We do not have any clear-cut answer how to achieve that, but at least we should have a very neutral view in thinking about the future of the banking industry without overly motivated by the public hostility or political motivation. I think the countercyclical buffer is one of the ideas for the macroprudential policy tool. And as you know, before the financial crisis until 2007, is a period called Great Moderation. And during that period, people believe that there was a success of the macro policy and microprudential policy. Macro policy such as monetary policy should seek for a specific CPI inflation rate, and on the other hand, prudential policy should focus on the stability of each financial institution. That is the microprudential policy solely. But we experienced a global financial crisis in 2008 and Lehman shock, and we now understand we need something more to maintain the stability of the economy as well as the financial system. And now many people are talking about the macroprudential policy. And countercyclical buffer is one of the tools. And of course there's another tools, lot of tools which are the potential tools for the macroprudential policy, such as the LTV or DTI, or the use of the dynamic provisioning system. But of course the countercyclical buffer is one of them. And of course if we can use it in a proper mode, there's a potential that the counter cyclical buffer should be useful, but of course there's a couple of practical issues. How to coordinate the counter cyclical buffer on a global basis, because banks are now operating in many countries, and if one country introduces a counter cyclical buffer, they should maintain the fair competitive background among all the financial institutions. That is not easy. And the second one is we have to pay due attention to the incentives of the banking industry. For example, if banks believe that the counter-cyclical buffer is mandatory and they could not use this buffer even at the period of economic slowdown, the counter-cyclical buffer might lead to just increase the regulatory burden. And in a similar vein, if banks try to increase their risky business so as to satisfy the ROE need, return on equity need, in terms of the increasing the high risk, high return businesses, counter-cyclical buffer may not work well so as to stabilize the economy. So of course counter-cyclical buffer has some potential to be effective as a macroprudential tool, but we have to be very careful in making it very practical and pay due attention to the incentives of the banking industries. RRP should be mandatory for all GCPs, but at this juncture, we cannot disclose any specific name of GCPs, and each financial institution should not know whether it is GCP or not. So we cannot answer to that question in a direct manner, because any institution should not know whether they have to make RRP or not. But as you know, the schedule is very tight. And for example, in a recovery plan, all GCP will be required to make a first draft at the end of until the end of this year. By the end of this year, the schedule is very tight, and this sort of the tightness of the schedule is the same for all the financial institutions in the world. But in terms of Japanese case, we already experienced Japan's financial crisis, and due to that sort of experience of the crisis, Japanese banks, especially the big banks, which experienced the public capital injection, have already streamlined or rationalized their business lines. Originally, they did not deal with originate to distribute type businesses. Their business model is a very the traditional and classical one, and so their corporate or business structure is not so complicated compared to their global peers. And the second one is that Japanese authorities and Japanese legal system already established a new framework for the bank resolution, and we actually dissolved a couple of big financial institutions without causing any cross-border spillovers, such as the Mizuno Bank's case. So, as a whole, I believe that Japanese banks, as well as the Japanese authorities, should overcome the new requirement of RRPs. One of the most difficulty which bank regulators and supervisors face is the hardening behavior of the market. For example, you mentioned the recovery plan. And in the recovery plan, banks are expected to make a plan to, for example, sell a non-critical part of the businesses and maintain the critical part of businesses. But in a systemic crisis, there's maybe at least a couple of financial institutions who will face the difficulty. And if they trigger their own recovery plan simultaneously and try to sell the similar businesses all together, what will happen? No one knows. That is the most difficult part of the financial regulation, financial supervision. And we do not have any clear-cut answer to that. So it's very difficult, but good but difficult question. But we should bear in mind the possibility of the change in the structure of various, such as variable. For example, in terms of risk management, we tend to think about some sort of the correlation between various financial variable. But this sort of correlation may change due to the holding behavior. And we have to bear in mind the possibility of structural change in the financial market. And if we think about the early warning, we will face a similar difficulty. For example, if we announce to put the specific weight on the specific indicators, and if we announce to see this indicator so as to anticipate the crisis or like that, maybe in the future this sort of indicator may lose their information value because of the change in the structure. So in order to avoid the next crisis, we should be open-minded and try to look at the variety of indicators in a neutral manner so as to pick up useful information from such variables. There's a principle of high risk, high return. So if they understand the returns also and also the risks of this financial institution and financial instrument, and if they can use these new instruments so as to achieve the more optimal portfolio, it's a good thing always. And the situation is the same as the structured product or securitization product. For example, securitized product is a new product, and in principle, they would support achieving the optimal portfolio, realization of the optimal portfolio. But if investors do not understand the risk and return profile fully, they might also be the cause of the risks at the same time. I think the situation is always the same for any financial instrument. If the yield is high, there's a couple of reasons why the yield should be high. So, and if they understand the reason behind the high yield, and if they will understand the structure of the product and make use of these products so as to achieve the optimal portfolio, this is basically a good thing. Largely, it depends on the design of the CCP. Basically, the use of CCP is to shift the bilateral transaction to the transaction with CCP. And of course, for each financial institution risk management views, CCP has some potential to reduce the risks as a whole. But at the same time, risk may be accumulated in the CCPs themselves. So there's a couple of conditions so as to reduce the risks as a whole financial system. First of all, the CCP system should be incentive compatible. They should encourage each financial institution as a participant to reduce the risks, monitor the risks, and reduce the risks. And the second one is that CCPs themselves should have incentives to reduce their own risks accumulated within themselves, because the CCP itself may have the effect of absorbing risks to themselves. So we need some sort of the incentives for the CCPs to reduce or monitor their own risks. And if we could design this sort of the incentive compatible system, the CCP system should have some potential to reduce the risks as a whole.